Hello there, and welcome to our brand new series, Hidden Gems in the Cotswolds. Such was the success of our Exploring the Cotswolds series that we decided to look at the region from a slightly different perspective. We're going to seek out small villages, lesser known buildings, sometimes even small artifacts. Come with us and let's go and find some wonderful Cotswold gems. We're starting this episode in the little village of Yarnton, just outside Oxford. Then we'll visit the village of Wootton, just outside Woodstock. We're going to take you to the lovely hidden church of St Mary's in Glympton. We're going to visit the lovely village of Charlbury, right on the edge of the Blenheim estate. We'll be coming to Finstock to visit the beautiful central village, hidden in the depths of the Evenlode Valley. And finally, we've come to the little mining village of Stonesfield. Yarnton is just a few miles west of Oxford, just off the A44. To get to the best of this little village, you need to drop off the main road and drive into the village proper. Watch for signs to the church and follow the lane till you find yourself opposite the main entrance to the manor house and next to the church of St Bartholomew. Norman in origin, this little church was largely rebuilt in the 13th century and then, in the 17th century, substantially enlarged by the owners of the manor house next door, the Spencer family. This is the Spencer family of Althorpe, one of England's oldest families and the ancestors of Princess Diana, who played such a big part in the 20th century. They expanded the church to house their magnificent monuments. In 1611, Sir Thomas Spencer of Yarnton built the southwest tower and the chapel at the eastern end of the south aisle, known as the Spencer Chapel. It's in thoroughgoing perpendicular style with fine, large windows. The monuments include that to Sir William Spencer, who died in 1609, and his wife Margaret. It was commissioned by their son, Sir Thomas, from a sculptor from the Netherlands called Jasper Hollemans. He'd carved similar tombs for the family in Northamptonshire. This extremely ornate carving was typical of the Flemish style. The chapel also has the largest collection of early 17th century armorial glass in the country. Just outside the door of the church is an unusual cross with elaborate decoration. On the base are sculpted 4 knights kneeling on one knee and canopied figures of ecclesiastics on the shaft. Another cross of almost identical design can be found in Ensham churchyard, and between the two are the remains of others, now largely lost to the plough. In episode 1 of Exploring the Cotswolds, we found this extraordinary cross and we discovered that it was a stopping off point for religious pilgrimages in the Middle Ages. We've found several since, the last one in Eastleach, much more recently. Evans writes of Yarnton, "No events of national import have given Yarnton a place in the pages of history, but the night of June the 3rd, 1644, must have been long remembered by the villagers. It was on this night that the king, at the head of 3,000 horse and 2,500 foot, made his memorable dash from Oxford between two armies destined by the Parliament to complete the circumvallation of the city. Essex on his left and Waller on his right were within a few hours of joining together and entirely encircling Oxford. It wouldn't have taken more than a fortnight for the city to have been driven to surrender. This catastrophe was only prevented by the spirited resolution and prompt action of the king. His object was to secure the passage of the river Evenlode at Hanborough Bridge, a point about midway between the hostile armies, before either of their generals had any suspicion that he'd quitted Oxford. Keeping out of sight of his enemies by sticking to the low path between the hills on either side, he achieved his end and survived to fight another day. Travelling northwest through Woodstock, down the A44, we leave the spectacular Blenheim Palace on our left, and a couple of miles further on, we take a turning right, signposted Wootton. In the Middle Ages, Wootton was larger and more important than the stockade in the woods that was Woodstock. They were both in the middle of the Forest of Wychwood, a royal hunting forest covering a huge part of the area, but Wootton was the administrative centre. The subsequent royal connection in Woodstock gave this more widely known settlement the advantage, and Wootton was left to its core cottage industry of glove making, for which, it seems, it had no equal. Anthony Wood, the great 17th century antiquarian, wrote that the water of the river Glym, which runs through the valley on which Wootton is balanced, hath so great virtue therein, that all the skins of a more delicate kind are so well seasoned with it for the making of white leather, that none whiter, softer, or better is hardly found. Wootton's history of cottage industry means that it remains an almost undisturbed medieval village. Little lanes zigzagging up and down the steep valley sides, pretty cottages, several of which used to be pubs of one kind or another, and now the homes of the residents of a thriving rural community. In the 18th and 19th century, this village was sometimes referred to as Wootton Whitechurch, presumably because of the prominence of the lovely church that stands at the top of the valley. There was certainly a church on this site by 1178, but like all churches in the area, it has been altered, added to, improved, and vandalised throughout its history. On the day we arrived, wonderful work was going on in the extensive churchyard, which was fascinating for us as stones of enormous antiquity were being revealed from the undergrowth. And it was clear to us that some great work had recently been completed inside the church. Some beautiful, modern, heavy glass inner doors had been fitted to the porch, and an area of the church had been cleared of pews, presumably to provide an extremely useful space for the village to use for various events and activities. It's a tricky business messing with ancient buildings to make sure they still provide a service for their community. But doing it with sensitivity and style is less easy. I think the people of the parish of Wootton seem to have hit the nail pretty much on the head. There are enough of the 19th century oak pews left for the congregation to sit in, along with the contemporary pulpit, the 14th century font, octagonal with vertically convex sides, and the memorials and arms on the walls are probably more visible than heretofore. The feel of the church is welcoming and friendly. We wish them luck with the project. Taking the road north, past the great Killingworth Castle pub, recently reopened after a serious kitchen fire, we head for a secretive and sleepy village of Glympton. This little village belongs to the estate of Glympton and as a result is pretty much unchanged in the last few hundred years. It's a secret place, huddled beneath the great house in the traditional way. It sits on a fork in the road, surrounded by trees, with a small almshouse building and around 20 cottages. There was a manor house here since at least 1550, and since the current house is right next to the medieval church, it seems likely that it stands on the original site. There's nothing older than 18th century in the house today, which was built in the early 1700s by the Wheat family after they'd acquired the estate in 1633. It was probably to a design by Sir John Vanbrugh, the architect of Blenheim Palace. Sketches of what looked like the current house had been found, along with more formal drawings by Vanbrugh to restore and renovate the old building, which were never used. In 1846, the estate passed to George Barnet, the son of a London banker. The Barnets were an interesting family. Curtis Barnet, who lived between 1696 and 1746, followed his father into the Navy and, progressing rapidly through the ranks, became a captain in 1731. He was made commodore of a small squadron sent to the Bay of Bengal in 1744 to attack French trading vessels. A single action, which resulted in his securing significant prize money, quickly recovered British command of the bay. Curtis's second son, Benjamin, decided against following in his father's footsteps and went instead into banking, becoming a partner in Barnet, Hoare, Hanbury and Lloyd, later to become Lloyd's Bank. In 1770, he married Avis, the eldest daughter of Sir George Wheat, who brought with her the Glympton estate. Behind me is another one of those great crosses. Some of you will remember that we first came across one of these in Yarnton, not very far from here. They mark the stopping point of pilgrimage and procession in medieval times. The vast majority of them were extremely vandalised during the terrible times at the end of Henry VIII's reign, the beginning of Elizabeth's reign. And in most cases, all that's really left is the base. But on this occasion, we've got the whole thing with the cross at the top and everything. It's beautiful, it's elegant, it's a wonderful find, and I'm delighted to see it. The Barnet family sold the estate in 1944 during the Second World War, and it was bought by Alan Good, the Anglo-Irish head of a successful engineering company. Good died prematurely in 1953, and the estate found its way, after a spell at the tender mercies of Alan Bond, the disgraced Australian businessman, into the hands of the Saudi Arabian prince Bandar bin Sultan Al Saud, who invested millions in its repair and remodelling, by Philip Jebb, who died in 1995, and the work was continued and completed by Nicholas Johnson and Peter Cave. Recently it's been sold once again and is now owned by King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa of Bahrain. The sale of the estate included the 18th century Glympton house, as well as 39 cottages, a Norman parish church, and 167 acres of parkland. It is the existence of this little parish church that makes it possible for us to walk through this estate and get an impression of the beauty and grandeur of the place. An ancient footpath runs down the main drive of the estate to allow residents of local villages to get to the church, and nothing, not even the influence of a king, can divert or close an English right-of-way. We follow the road right through Glympton back onto the A44, heading northwest, and skirting the huge estate of Ditchley Park, take the next left towards the village of Charlbury. This is an interesting little village. During the time of Woodstock and Wootton, the villages we've already visited, this was probably no more than a sort of clearing in the woods, the great Witchwood Forest of which we've spoken. Now it's an extremely beautiful little village, Much expanded in the 20th century, it has to be said, but the old core village is lovely, and we're going to show you around. Charlbury was probably first settled in early Anglo-Saxon times. Its name suggests a fortification from the word borough, and the name of a local bigwig, probably Courl. It's certain there was scattered occupation of the area at the time of the Romans and even earlier, but the first proper settlement seems to have been Saxon. Most of the grander houses in the town, however, date from or were extensively rebuilt in the 18th century. It looks as though the early town was a simple village of small, rubble-built cottages. The town lies on the eastern bank of the River Evenlode, a river we've mentioned often, not least as an obstacle to the armies in the Civil War. It's another of these shallow, clear streams fed by springs higher in the hills, and it flows east to join the Thames near Wolvercote. The way this town has developed owes a lot to the fact that it has fallen under the control of a succession of hugely influential religious institutions and families, all of whom were absentee landlords. There was a market granted to the town by Henry III in 1256, but it doesn't appear to have been particularly successful, and the town doesn't really feel as if it has a centre. Pre-Reformation, the Abbey of Ensham ruled supreme here, and subsequently, after the reign of Henry VIII, the families of Lee at Ditchley, 2 miles to the north, took over the manor for 200 years. Leading, amidst a tangled tale of widowhood, debauchery and bawdy verse, to an association with the Earl of Rochester, and finally into the hands of the Churchill family, later to become the Dukes of Marlborough. This is the family in whose domain the town still lies, within the enormous Blenheim estate. We've seen glimpses of it in the past. The 21st century family are very far from absentee landlords, and the recent development of the town reflects their proximity. Communications have always been good here, and when the railway arrived, Isambard Kingdom Brunel himself built a station at Charlbury, which still stands. It's built in the chalet style he favoured, and is the only one of its kind to survive on his famous Oxford, Worcester and Wolverhampton Railway. The presence of the railway has, of course, helped Charlbury rise above its slightly undignified start in life, and there is a buzz of active village life here with a strong sense of community. This perhaps shows itself particularly well in the story of the Church of St. Mary the Virgin. For the full story of their late 20th century woes, you can visit their website, but suffice here to say that they were attacked by all the structural pests you can think of: beetles, floods, rots of various kinds, even fire, and a huge refurbishment became necessary. Over £250,000 was raised locally to do the work, and a decision was made to reorder the church with the creation of a second western altar, the removal of the 19th century deal pews, and the replacement of the old wooden floor with Cotswold stone. The overall effect may not be to everybody's taste, but the success of the scheme for the villagers and the building's use and survival is clear for all to see. The particularly wonderful spiral staircase onto the bell-ringer's platform, built in the late 17th century, is worth a journey to Charlbury all on its own. The nearby estate of Cornbury Park, less than a mile from the village on the other side of the railway line, is a wonderful house with a long history as a hunting lodge in the Royal Forest of Wychwood. It was probably first erected by Henry I in the early 12th century, but most of what we see today is 16th or 17th century. It's a private house and access is strictly controlled, but there are businesses in the outbuildings, and in the grounds the owners hold one of the very best music festivals in the area. It was here, in these fields, with the glorious floodlit house as a backdrop, that I was lucky enough to hear two of my great idols, Joe Cocker and Amy Winehouse, before they sadly both left us. We now followed the River Evenlode downstream for a couple of miles, where we discovered the village of Finstock, whose name we assume indicates another stockade in the forest of Wychwood. It's a lovely little village, this. It's hidden in a valley in much the same way Cotswold villages always are, but it shows very strongly the effects of the 20th century as it spreads up the valley sides. Come with me and I'll show you round. Circling the Blenheim and Cornbury estates, we've happened upon the village of Finstock. Now, the truth is that the 20th century influence on this village is so strong that the bits of it that would normally interest us, like the church and the Jacobean manor house, and yes, of course, the pub, are almost obliterated. But the key word is almost. The village started its life huddled in the bottom of the steepest part of the valley, with a triangular village green surrounded with cottages, a meeting hall, a pub, a blacksmith, and a school with the manor house looking down from above. You can still see the pattern of the village streets in the roads that run through the village today. It was another of those spontaneous settlements on a convenient river crossing that sprung up in a clearing of the Wychwood forest. Cottage industries of glove-making, a bit of weaving, and a pretty much self-sufficient farming system made for a successful, albeit tiny, community. The church is, by local standards, modern. It was built in the early 1840s in the Gothic Revival style, with an ornate chancel added in 1905. There must have been an expectation of a change in the village, as the church is much bigger than the original village would have needed, and the date seems to bear that out. In the late 1840s and early 50s, the railway came to Finstock, and along with it, the Industrial Revolution. From that moment, Finstock was destined to expand. In all directions up the valley sides and along the contours of the hills, residential development grew and went on growing into the 20th and 21st centuries. The village is now a very substantial settlement. Now, all my instincts were to dislike this place. I've been travelling with Herbert Evans for several years now, and in his book, The Highways and Byways of Oxford and the Cotswolds, written in 1905, he laments the occasional introduction of red slates on the roofs or bricks in the walls. If he were to wake up and see Finstock now, he would turn over and die all over again. But the strange thing is, I think he'd be wrong to feel that way. Yes, the pub with its thatched roof and brilliantly cosy bars and snugs is positively angelic to look at, and indeed to visit. Yes, there are loads of pretty ordinary houses filling the gaps between the beautiful old stuff, but the strong sense of community here and the friendliness of the locals demonstrates that what's most important in life is the people who go to make up these settlements. The publican told me that throughout the pandemic of 2021, the villagers supported him in every way they could, buying takeaway food, jugs of beer and so on, just to ensure his survival. He is eternally grateful to them. The church is beautifully kept, the graveyard is mown, the doors are always open for curious people like me to look at the lovely little font, probably dating from the same decade as the church itself, the solid stone pulpit built in 1866, the lavish carn stone reredos and other decorative style chancel fittings, and in the churchyard a classical mausoleum to Sir Arthur du Cross, built by Spencer Chadwick of London. I think the Art Nouveau style railings are wonderful, and all of it so well looked after. So much so, I resisted climbing the gate to gain access, and so should you. This all speaks of a vibrant, involved community, with all the spirit of local village life intact. Here is a village to visit in your travels. Have a drink in the plough, chat to the family owners, 2 generations of whom work hard to create a great atmosphere. Walk through the village and experience a slow and steady procession through the centuries, accepting that recently we may not have got the aesthetics right, but we do still know how to create a community. Completing our circumnavigation of the Blenheim estate, we travel a mile due east of Finstock, down leafy, single-track lanes, to the village of Stonesfield. So we've taken a journey of about 2.5 miles from Finstock, and we've come to Stonesfield, a little village that is world famous for a remarkable tile. Almost all the ancient Cotswold cottages are roofed with thin stone tiles that originated in this village. Come with me and I'll show you around. The name Stonesfield seems appropriate for this lovely village, as it's the source of the exquisite thin stone slates that adorn the roofs of so many buildings in the area. By a strange coincidence, however, the name actually derives from the word Stonesfeld, the name given to the settlement in the Domesday Book, meaning Fool's Field, because of the difficult stony ground surrounding it. Stonesfield is that rare thing in the Cotswolds, a mining village. The whole of the area in and around the village is pitted with mines and shafts, from which the stone or pendle was hauled up and covered with earth to await a frost. When one was expected, the whole village would turn out to uncover the stone and allow the frost to split it into slates, which would then be trimmed and shaped for roofing. If the frost was at night, the church bells would be rung to wake the village up. The last mine closed before the First World War, and demand for replacement slates is now met from demolished buildings. They're becoming increasingly difficult to get. The legacy of the mines is still felt in the village, as many of the buildings have suffered settlement in various degrees of severity. The same geological history makes this village the source of some of the most spectacular fossil finds in England. Over 160 million years ago, the area was at the edge of a shallow sea, and a barrier of sandbanks formed a calm lagoon close to the land. In this water and the muddy sand that formed its floor accumulated the remains of a huge range of marine and land life. Perhaps the most exciting of all the finds in Stonefield was the very first creature to be named a dinosaur. The lower jaw of the carnivorous Megalosaurus, 9 meters long in life and weighing about a ton, was discovered here in 1824. It now lives in the Museum of Natural History in Oxford. It was certainly not the only find here. Our understanding of the environment of the Middle Jurassic Sea has been immensely improved by the many finds in Stonesfield. Seashells, limpets and barnacles, as well as the extremely fragile dragonfly wings, are an extraordinary legacy. The western end of the village retains its old character, with winding lanes and rows of slaters' cottages on the side of the hill, but during the 20th century the village has expanded considerably. It's always the case where hard manual work was the lifeblood of a village that several pubs would open up to satisfy the thirst of the workers. When industry declines, so does the number of drinking establishments. It seems sad, however, that this decline in numbers wasn't halted quite in time for the building of large new housing estates around the village, and it looks as though the last of the pubs will now close forever. I'm told that a huge and successful effort was made by the locals to raise money to buy the White Horse, but that sadly the owners didn't wait for them to succeed, and sold the building instead to a property developer. If this is true, it is very sad for the inhabitants of this lovely village, which will only be lacking a pub to make it a perfect place to live. The small 13th century church of St. James and its cemetery sit just off the village square and are well worth a visit. There was a slightly destructive restoration in the early 19th century, but much of the original building survives. The excellent chancel arch and the trefoil-headed piscina are lovely, and the 14th century octagonal font and polygonal pulpit dated 1629 worth a visit on their own. There's some great stained glass from 14th and 15th centuries, and for those interested in arms, a selection of shields, the deciphering of which I leave to others more expert than I. Next to the gate into the square is the old lock-up, a daunting little place with a small barred window, into which, no doubt, were slung those slaters who had over-imbibed in the many pubs of the day. Stonesfield was built very close to Ackerman Street, one of the several Roman roads to cross this region, and the remains of Roman villas have been found here. At the beginning of the 18th century, one villa was discovered with 4 richly patterned 4th century mosaics, along with baths and Roman heating systems, but astonishingly were entirely destroyed later in the century. A lesson, perhaps, that it has always been the case that if you take your eye off the wonderful heritage with which we're blessed for a second, someone with a vested interest in conflict with its survival will seek to destroy it. I must admit, the more I travel the region, the more concerned I get that the voices of conservation and aesthetic appreciation are not ringing loud enough. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Stonesfield. It's an extraordinary thought that this wonderful village is sitting on top of all these wonderful tunnels, from which the great stone roofs of the Cotswolds came. Well, I hope you've enjoyed episode 2. We started in this lovely village of Yarnton. Then we visited Wootton near Woodstock with its remarkable church doors, brand new. And we visited the little hidden church in the village of Glympton with its beautiful cross, almost complete. Lovely place. We visited the wonderful village of Charlbury and the Cornbury estate. That was beautiful. We visited Finstock with its lovely thatched pub. And we ended up in the lovely village of Stonesfield. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can find us on all the other platforms, and go to our website, thecotswoldexplorer.co.uk, where you'll find everything we do.